Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient. Our stories are brilliant. We are resilient.
Hello, and welcome to the Courage Checklist podcast. My name is Jennifer Byers-Chambers. I'm a writer, a publisher, and a podcaster. Today we'll talk about what the Courage Checklist is, and then we'll go over the main types of courage. Each week, for the next several weeks, we'll go over one type of courage per time and give real-life examples. Sometimes we'll have interviews, or sometimes we'll share other people's courage checklists. Because of my profession, I try to use the who, what, when, where, why, how structure often. This podcast is about sharing our courage experiences and encouraging others to be more courageous in all areas of our lives. My what is the whole concept behind the courage checklist itself. A courage checklist is more than just a bucket list, in that it isn't the things that are theoretical maybes. The courage checklist is a list of things that are not only your wildest dreams, but smaller things you've never learned to do, or felt that you couldn't accomplish. Some examples could be studying art in Paris, or learning to run marathons, or becoming a chef after being strictly a cheese and crackers and frozen dinners type of person. It can be hard things, like public speaking, or things like speaking your truth about something important to you. One of my personal list items was learning to drive a car. Everyone's list is different, but we all share the sense of courage that it will take to do the hard things on our lists. There's a reason why they're hard. My operating principle is that writing down the list is one of the most important things that you can do. Secondly, one of my principles is that these types of lists are not static lists. You're allowed to subtract or add to the list at any time. That's what makes it important. Flexibility and kindness to yourself is also important, and that extends to doing things on your list. Sometimes these list items touch a chord and or bring up a lot of emotions, and that's okay. I encourage everyone to get the help or professional assistance they need if that's what's best for you. Of course, this podcast is not medical or professional advice. Now, why a courage checklist? I know a whole lot about checking things off a list. I sustained a traumatic brain injury in a car accident when I was 15. I had injuries to all parts of my brain. Doctors call it a diffuse brain injury when the brain is shaken up as if a soda bottle in something like a car accident. There are bony parts of the skull that stick out and shear off parts of the brain when that happens. With my injury, because I had that kind of a car crash, I was injured in multiple parts of my brain. I had to relearn everything, especially things like walking, speaking, the concept of interpersonal communication. I still have no memory of any events before the accident. After I had recovered somewhat, about 6 months or so later, my parents and doctors had a meeting in our front room. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I was 15 and I was curious. I crept into the adjoining kitchen and I listened as they made a list together of things that I would never be able to do. They took some time back and forth to make the list. Each thing they agreed on hit my heart like a rock. They agreed that I'd never be able to do most of the things that people take for granted. These things were things like living unassisted, living with a family, graduating high school, going to college, getting married, having a job, having children, driving a car. The list had things that were minuscule too, like learning to tie my shoes. It had things that felt impossible at the time, like navigating my way by myself through a grocery store. I was absolutely devastated. But that list of things kind of got burned into my brain. The next day, I asked my occupational therapist to help write all of the things down on a list. I talked to my parents about it, and they never dreamed that I'd hear and be upset by the list, but it was reality. One of my hardest items, like I mentioned earlier, was learning to drive the car. It felt so monumental to me. I'm from a small rural town where kids get their beat-up pickups and a special farm license, and they can drive a car at 14 or 15. It was one of the things that felt most insurmountable to me. It was so terrifying, and also it was one of the most regular places that normal people could do. At first, after I'd gotten out of the hospital, I was able to visit my family home for a few hours at a time. This was kind of funny for a different reason. After my brain injury, and after a lot of brain injuries, it's very common to have a sense of persecution and extreme suspicion. I didn't remember anything, right? And that included my family. I knew no faces or relationships. I called my dad, actually by the name of my dog at the time. I didn't trust that these people were my family, which is also kind of darkly amusing, I guess, because who else would show up and sit by your bed all the time? I was very, very lucky to have the support that I had. I was so afraid of everything, though, and a lot of that was because of my injury. When I heard things around me speaking, just regular speaking levels from people was so loud, it was like yelling, even though if it was in reality a reasonable volume. I was just in excruciating pain all the time because I had a separated shoulder and a fractured hip that were lingering seatbelt accidents, lingering seatbelt injuries from my accident, as well as the injuries from my jaw and my face, which eventually had to be reconstructed. It was hard to eat because my facial injuries, of course, and my jaw being broken. But the most frightening thing I can recall is that each day we had to drive from my home past the road where the accident had been on the way to and from the hospital for my outpatient care. Even riding in a car for a long time, it made me just want to vomit. I had to hold my breath to get close to a vehicle. The sense of terror is so hard to describe. It's almost like I had to imagine being out of my body in order to be able to handle it. There was no alternative, of course. I mean, I couldn't ride a bike 30 miles home, but I remember sitting as still as possible once I got into any vehicle. My arms were tight. I moved as little as I could. Of course, that is until I fell asleep. When you have a brain injury, you sleep a whole lot. My brain needed it to heal, so I guess it was a small mercy. I did try to drive after a while, since it was what I thought was a constant reminder that I couldn't do the things that everybody else in the world could do. At 18 or so, I took a community college driver's ed class. That was the first time I took it. I did not pass. Spoiler alert. When the time came to take the actual driving portion, I just couldn't do it. Nope, it was like a wall. My mind couldn't go there. The thought of being in control of a possibly lethal 3,000-pound piece of metal and glass was like a visceral risk to me every time I got into a car. I felt it on a cellular level, just about. I went back and I took lessons a few years later, and it did get easier to be in a car. In some ways, it was easier to not be in control, since I couldn't control what happened. Anyway, but the lessons, every time I tried them, they just didn't take. Eventually, my husband and I decided that we'd structure our whole lives so that I could walk or I could ride my bike everywhere. I'll never not be grateful for that and for having a partner willing to do that. It's not too bad to do that where I live in the Pacific Northwest. It might not be as easy as in big cities, but we make it work. We live within walking distance of the grocery store and the doctor and the school and the post office and the bank and restaurants, most importantly, the library. And I bought an electric bike. When I started having kids, I got a bike trailer, and I hauled my kids and my groceries and my library books. It wasn't always easy, but I managed it all because I wrote down my routes and my directions. I took the kids on bus adventures to other towns and other places. These aren't uncommon things to do. But strangely, the sense of shame I had was completely disproportionate to my reality. All I could feel was how I had to get a ride when it rained. Not that I was able to do pretty much anything I needed to, with a few modifications. I finally learned to drive when I was 42. My son was turning 16, and I thought if there's one thing I do, it's getting my license before my own kid. I actually took lessons from my dad that time. We were in the lift bed, unrestored turquoise pickup farm truck, the old Ford that had been my grandfather's in the late 60s. Once during my lessons, I actually backed out of my garage and I accidentally took out part of the door frame. I haven't fixed it yet. It's kind of a good reminder. But other than that, no damage to anything so far. I think I'm actually a better and more careful driver than some people. I certainly feel like it. And it's not all sparkles and rainbows, right? I won't lie. I don't love driving, especially in big cities. I'm most comfortable in small towns. I'm most comfortable on 2-lane country roads, short highways, small bursts of high speeds. But I can do it if I need to or if I have to. And I have to say, I'm secretly very proud of myself every day when I pick up or take my daughter to school. It's such a small victory, but I'm so happy about it. Today, I want to thank you for choosing to share your time with me, and I hope that you get something out of our show today. I encourage you to download and fill out your courage checklist, and please email the show at couragechecklist@gmail.com to share it, or if you have any questions for me. I'll be back next time, and I'll share our first type of courage, and then I'll talk about some ways that courage has been displayed. Thanks so much. Have a wonderful day. So, as I said, this season we're going to be discussing the different types of courage and examples of that. So, one of the resources that I will link in the show notes is an article by Dr. Chris Drew, Ph.D., and he talks about having 6 types of courage. So the courage that I used that day when I was learning to drive and I actually got in the car and did the thing was what he calls emotional courage. In one meaning of the term, it's the courage to be vulnerable and feeling things for others, despite the fact that you could be involved and you might get heartbroken. So in an emotional way, but also a type of emotional courage, Dr. Drew says, is facing your former fears. So that can be things like exposure therapy, like literally what I did. And it just took a while, but I kept at it. And I did learn the thing. I learned to do what I needed and wanted to do. But emotional courage could also be, of course, going to therapy to resolve fears or issues. Emotional courage also could mean things like falling in love and taking that leap, or having relationships with friends and family. I'll link that resource, like I said, in the show notes, and I'm going to be linking different kinds of resources every week. I think that it's really interesting to learn about different people's experiences with courage. And for me, it's very expansive to learn those things. Today's article is by Dr. Chris Drew. Each week, I'll speak about a different book that kind of speaks to me on the topic that we're going to be talking about this week. And this week's book is The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho. This is kind of a polarizing book. Some people love it, some people hate it. I loved it, and I've reread it a few times. I'm going to read you the description. Santiago, a young shepherd living in the hills of Andalusia, feels that there's more to life than his humble home and his flock. One day, he finds the courage to follow his dreams into distant lands, each step galvanized by the knowledge that he is following the right path, his own. The people he meets along the way, the things he sees, and the wisdom he learns are life-changing. With Paulo Coelho's visionary blend of spirituality, magical realism, and folklore, The Alchemist is a story with the power to inspire nations and change people's lives. Thank you so much for sharing your day with us. Please send feedback or your list to the voicemail link or to couragechecklist@gmail.com. Please follow the show and then follow us on Instagram at thecouragechecklist. Have a wonderful day.